Okay, this is the second part of chapter 6, and I'm beginning on page 70 at the very bottom, the last paragraph. "Here we are," said Mr. Beaver, "and it looks as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. I'll lead the way, but be careful and don't slip." At the top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not for humans, a very nice place to walk because it was covered with ice. And though the frozen pool was level with it on one side, there was a nasty drop to the lower river on the other. Along this route, Mr. Beaver had led them in single file right out to the middle where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down it. And when they had reached the middle, they were at the door of the house. "Here we are, Mrs. Beaver," said Mr. Beaver. "I've found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve." And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed as she went in was a burring sound, and the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth, working busily at her sewing machine, and it was from it that the sound came. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. "So you've come at last," she said, holding out both her wrinkled old paws. "At last! To think that I should ever live to see this day. The potatoes are on boiling, and the kettle's singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish." "That I will," said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house, Peter went with him, and across the ice of the deep pool to where he had a little hole in the ice, which he kept open every day with his hatchet. They took a pail with them. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so chilly, looked hard into it, and then suddenly shot in his paw, and before you could say Jack Robinson, he had whisked out a beautiful trout. And then he did it all over again until they had a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver to fill the kettle and lay the table and cut the bread and put the plates in the oven to heat and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from a barrel which stood in one corner of the house, and to put on the frying pan and to get the dripping hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures, and instead of beds there were bunks, like on board ship, built into the wall. There were hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof, and against the walls were gum boots and oilskins and hatchets and pairs of shears and spades and trowels and things for carrying mortar in, and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks. And the cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Just as the frying can was nicely Start again. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in the open air. You can think how good the new caught fish smelled while they were frying, and how the hungry children longed for them to be done, and how very much hungrier still they had become before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and put them all back in the empty pot to dry on the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout, so that in a very few minutes everyone was drawing up their stools. It was all three-legged stools in the Beavers' house, except for Mrs. Beaver's own special rocking chair beside the fire, and preparing to enjoy themselves. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children, Mr. Beaver stuck to beer, and a great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as he wanted to go with his potatoes. And all the children thought, and I agree with them, that there's nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it has been alive half an hour ago and has come out of the pan half a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and glorious sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire so that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured out. And when each person had got his or her cup of tea, each person shoved back his or her stool so as to be able to lean against the wall and gave a long sigh of contentment. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling his cup of tea toward himself, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit up and going nicely, why, now we can get to business. It's snowing again," he added, cocking his eye at the window. "That's all the better, because it means we shan't have any visitors. And if anyone should have been trying to follow you, why, he won't find any tracks." That's the end of chapter 2.